Welcome back. So this is going to be the start of a short series of videos, and it really came about from the generosity and general awesomeness of a guy out in Ohio who sent me a bunch of very special sets to listen to. So I'm not going to do full reviews, but we're going to do this 2-minute review style, and really it's more about impressions and thoughts. And Oxygen is a little different because I had wanted to purchase this one so many times. So this one will probably be a little more different than the other ones. But let's get into it before my 2 minutes are up. So this is the Oxygen up close for those of you who have never got a close-up look at it. Super nice metal shells. The fit is a bit crazy because it's very shallow. So the nozzle, when you see it in pictures and you see it even here, it doesn't really look all that shallow, but when you try to put it in your ear, I really had to resort to something like Comply foam tips, which gave me a little more extension to fit in my ear. So yeah, the fit is definitely kind of wacky, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Not the stock cable. For those of you who are into upgrade cables, this is actually a nice HCK BlackJelly, kind of a custom version. So standard cable is fine. I just happen to have this one on my desk, and I like it. So it is graphene, nice silver and black. It looks kind of nice against Oxygen, so we'll go with that. So where to begin? So let's talk a slight bit of history. And for those of you who were around when Blonde BL03 was around, you know there was a little bit of history between the two, and which I won't actually talk about. But we'll look at how these two were sort of similar and the same and what really transpired after them. So Blonde BL03, the million of you who have that one kind of recognize this boosted bass, and then it kind of slopes down, bleeds into the mids quite a bit, and then there's this very gentle rise. And some will say this set's a little bit dark, it doesn't have the extension that it needs. The mids are a little congested and cloudy, but it's very natural sounding, very easygoing, non-fatiguing, all those good qualities. It's a very warm set. So when we look at Oxygen, bass level is dropped quite a bit less, and that's going to give you a nice, slow, gentle, almost no bleed into the mids, so very clean mids, and then a sharper up rise into the pinna gain, and then it kind of slopes over. And for those of you who are kind of familiar with the Blonde series, you'll recognize these two gain areas. So BL03 was always this lower set. BL01 is very much that upper set right there. And, over the past 2 years, lots of companies have tried to replicate these two graphs with different drivers and different shells, and they tend to all follow the same curves and then pick, which gain do you want, the higher or the lower gain. And Blonde has tried it 3 or 4 times already. But so after the gain, extension wise, you get much more out of Oxygen than you do out of Blonde. Blonde is this more fatiguing, very much more mid-centric, and then Oxygen very much takes it out further into the treble, and it sounds a lot more natural across the whole spectrum, more frequency range as opposed to BL03. But that's a 30-second version of those two. But for those of you who are around, you know that there is some linkage between the two, which is somewhat interesting, but not interesting enough right now. So let me quickly run through this. And so Oxygen was one of these sets that I had tried to purchase. It was in my cart, I don't know how many millions of times. Every sale, it was pretty much in my cart. And at sale prices on AliExpress, you're looking at really close to about $200. Regular, I think MSRP is about $289, but on sale, it pretty much hovers around $200. If you're really motivated and want to pick one up, go chat with a store and say, I'm interested in purchasing a Oxygen, and they will say it's about $210 is what the current sort of non-listed promotional price is going right now. So after listening to it for about 15 minutes, I really regretted not ever buying it in the past. It's really that good. And especially for you blonde fans who are always wanted that cleaner blonde, that's always what it was. No one could ever really convince me that's what it was, no matter how many people said how awesome Oxygen was, how it's the king of, 1DDs in this price range. Every review is pretty much the same. It's the king of DD in that price range. And no matter how many times people told me that, I never could really get over the fence to purchase it. So, again, so now that I have it in my ears, I very much regret not ever buying it in the past. So, why didn't I buy it in the past? Multiple times. After, many people said it didn't really have enough bass. The shallow fit, like I said, is kind of wacky. It's too fatiguing, too neutral, and not fun. So, I think there's enough people who like V-shaped sets, and it's really not a V-shaped set at all. It's more neutral sounding. So, I understand the criticism, but you have to understand where that comes from to understand what they're talking about, right? So this bass style is very natural. There's a minimal boost to it, but it's still quite impactful. It complements the mids, and it's still fun. It's just not for bass heads or even V-shaped boost fans. So it's really hard to get over that hump and understand what people mean when they say things. Bass is good, bass is bad, not enough bass. Also why I keep on showing graphs as much as I do, because I've sort of been burned by this again when people say it doesn't have enough bass. Well, it's maybe not enough for them, but you should be able to figure out if that's a appropriate level for you or not. So the fit, I will totally agree. It is shallow, and you're going to assume that you're going to have to do some tip rolling. First couple minutes with it is kind of wacky to make sure it's fitting in your ear and finding tips at all. Get a proper seal and deep enough and all that stuff. So, yep, 100% agree. The fit is kind of whack. Fatiguing. So this one really comes down to this whole area I just talked about. So this kind of upper mid peanut gain area, it's kind of sharp. There's a real emphasis to it. And I wouldn't say it's overly fatiguing, but if you're not used to it, I think it is a little bit fatiguing. And certainly after a couple hours at a high enough volume, it's certainly going to be fatiguing. And, I think BL03 chose that level for that exact reason, because the guy who tuned Oxygen also had a hand in O3. And I think sort of inherently knew that that was going to be an issue with Oxygen. So, I do think fatiguing a little bit, especially those female vocals, will kind of climb into your ear and kind of get up in you. But for me, it's still less fatiguing than some of the later peaks, especially like 5K and 8K. Those have an intensity, whereas 2K is kind of more of a shoutiness. There's just an elevation to the voice as opposed to these peaks, which have this weird intensity and it's piercing. That's not what Oxygen does. And it is surprisingly fun and energetic and engaging and revealing. It's very detailed for a 1DD, yet still musical for a neutralish tuning. It is a very great set, and no doubt about it. Every review that said it's a great set, 100% agree with that. So why would you buy it? One of the best tuned 1DDs, but definitely know where you are in this range. If you are a V-shaped fan, if you like a lot of bass, probably not your thing. If you're looking for something more natural and detailed, it's definitely in that ballpark. You love mids and vocals and instruments and believe they should be supported by the bass and the treble. So I love a good V-shape, but it tends to be the opposite, right? It tends to boost bass and a boost treble. Mids are kind of caught in the middle. Oxygen is very different. The bass is at this lower level, the treble is at a kind of a reduced yet extended level, very much supporting the mids, very much a vocal acoustics. If you have a playlist that says acoustic anything, Oxygen is probably going to be really good for you. And balance. It's kind of hard to find a single set that does so many things right, but yet it is not the best at probably any of them, which is the oddest thing about it. So clarity and transparency and detail and technicals and stage and imaging, timbre, all those things, those are like A minus level on Oxygen. But if you were to ask me for the most detailed set, the bassiest set, the best with the widest soundstage, it's probably never going to be any of those. So, like I said, so if you're one of those who is a seeker who always asks people, what's the most detailed set you have, or what's the widest soundstage, it's probably not going to come up. But it's the one that does so many things right, and so do take that into consideration when you're asking people for their opinion. What's the bassiest set? It's probably the one that has the most bass, but it's probably pretty crappy at everything else. So think about that before you ask. So why you want to skip it? You're into boosted bass or treble, like I talked about. Your library is more electronic, and this is one of those. It actually does electronic kind of okay, but I think it works better on a V-shape set. I mean, that's just my opinion on that. I like a bunch of electronic music, but for Oxygen, it's pretty much instruments and vocals are, I think, where its strong suit is. And so lastly, you prefer a more laid back or warmer presentation. And it kind of goes back to the O3. That's sort of what the O3 is known for. So if that's your thing, I would probably, go to a more inexpensive set, either an O3 or some of the other dynamic drivers out there. Oxygen is a bit too much money if you just want something that's has a little more bleed to it, that's a little more relaxed. I think there's other sets at cheaper prices than paying for all these other things, which are a little harder, much harder to find in cheaper sets. So that's about it. I think I got that about 10 minutes longer than it should have been, but again, this is one of a little series that we'll run through this week on some special sets. So thank you again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.